Welcome to a deep dive into narcissism. And let's be honest, sometimes it's kind of unsettling.
Yeah,
You've shared an excerpt from Narcissism and the Power of the Ego, and specifically you're interested in understanding just how dangerous narcissists can be.
right.
So we're going to try to break that down together.
That's a question that goes beyond just the stereotypical images of vanity. We're talking about some deeper psychology.
Exactly, because I think we all know someone who maybe loves the spotlight a little too much, but that doesn't make them automatically dangerous, right?
Exactly. The key is to distinguish between healthy self-esteem and what the text calls the distorted sense of importance. That's kind of the driver behind narcissism.
Okay, help me understand that distinction. What makes a narcissist's ego so different? I mean, isn't a little confidence a good thing?
Yeah. Healthy self-esteem means you have a realistic view of yourself, strengths and weaknesses. You're comfortable in your own skin, you know. But for a narcissist, that sense of self is really built on shaky ground. It's like they're constantly trying to prove their worth, not just to the world, but to themselves.
So their ego is less about genuine confidence and more about maybe masking some deep insecurity.
The text makes that argument pretty strongly. It suggests that this inflated ego is a defense mechanism, protecting a really deeply insecure core. That's why any criticism, even the slightest little perceived slight, can feel like a threat to their whole sense of self.
And that explains why they can be so reactive and defensive.
Precisely. Think of it like a house of cards. They've built this elaborate facade of superiority, but it's incredibly fragile. Any gust of wind, any challenge to that carefully constructed image could be the whole thing toppling down.
That actually makes a lot of sense. It's not just arrogance. It's this desperate need to protect a very vulnerable sense of self. And the text even talks about narcissistic personality disorder, NPD. Where does that fit in?
NPD is the clinical diagnosis, and it represents the extreme end of the narcissism spectrum. Professionals will diagnose this based on very specific criteria, but the core elements are this grandiosity, the need for constant admiration, and a lack of empathy, which is where the real danger starts to emerge.
Okay, before we get into the danger part, I have to ask, what's going on with that lack of empathy? It seems almost counterintuitive. If you're so focused on yourself, wouldn't you be hyper aware of how others perceive you?
That's where it gets really interesting. Narcissists often have a very keen ability to read people, but it's not about understanding or connecting with their emotions. It's about figuring out how to manipulate them for their own gain.
That's a little chilling. So they're not just oblivious to other people's feelings, they're actively using that to their advantage.
The source material really suggests that pattern. It argues that narcissists see relationships as transactional. People are tools to be used for validation, admiration, whatever they need in that moment.
Wow. Okay, so we've got this picture of someone with a huge but fragile ego, driven by insecurity and lacking empathy. No wonder the text calls them dangerous, but let's get specific. How does that danger actually play out in real life?
Well, the text outlines four key reasons why narcissists can be so harmful to the people around them. And I think you'll find they're all interconnected in some fascinating ways.
I'm all ears. Let's unpack these dangers. What's the first one?
The first danger is manipulation and control. Narcissists are often incredibly skilled at reading people and exploiting their weaknesses. They use a whole arsenal of tactics to get what they want, but the most insidious one, according to this text, is gaslighting.
Wait, gaslighting. Isn't that more of a psychological thriller trope than a real-life danger?
It might sound dramatic, but gaslighting is a very real form of manipulation. It involves distorting reality to make the victim doubt their own sanity. Imagine someone constantly denying your experiences or twisting your words or even making you question your own memory.
So it's not just about being controlling, it's about eroding the victim's sense of reality itself.
Mm-hmm.
That's terrifying.
It is. The long-term consequences of this kind of manipulation can be incredibly damaging, leading to anxiety, self-doubt, and even depression.
Okay, this is already painting a pretty grim picture. What's the second danger we need to be aware of?
The second danger is, perhaps unsurprisingly, that lack of empathy that we were talking about. Remember, narcissists really struggle to understand or even care about other people's feelings?
Yeah, but some people are just naturally less emotionally expressive. Doesn't mean they're automatically dangerous, right?
That's a good point. There's a spectrum, of course. But in the context of narcissism, this lack of empathy creates a real imbalance in relationships. It can manifest in so many ways, from ignoring a partner's emotional needs to completely steamrolling over colleagues in the workplace.
So even if it's not intentional cruelty, the impact can still be deeply hurtful, especially over time.
Absolutely. It's like they're walking through life with blinders on, completely oblivious to the emotional wreckage they might be leaving behind.
This is pretty heavy stuff.
Well,
What other dangers should we be on the lookout for?
well, the third one is particularly interesting. The source material calls it the relationship roller coaster. And it describes this really intense but ultimately unstable pattern that often plays out in romantic relationships with narcissists.
This roller coaster idea is fascinating. Could you walk us through a typical scenario from the text? What does that pattern actually look like?
It often starts with what they call love bombing. The narcissist will shower their target with affection, attention gifts. It's this whirlwind of intense emotions designed to completely sweep you off your feet.
Okay, so they create this incredible high, and then what?
Then once they feel they have you hooked, the control and manipulation start to creep in. The love bombing fades and it's replaced by criticism, belittling a constant need for validation.
I bet that shift is incredibly jarring for the person on the receiving end.
It is, and that's exactly what makes it so dangerous. This unpredictable cycle of intense highs and devastating lows can leave the victim feeling confused, drained, and completely dependent on the narcissist for emotional stability.
That sounds incredibly emotionally exhausting.
It is, and it can have real long-term consequences for the victim's self-esteem and ability to form healthy relationships in the future.
Okay, that covers personal relationships. But the source material also mentioned workplace havoc. How do narcissists wreak havoc in a professional setting? Is it the same pattern of manipulation and control?
It often is. Remember that need for admiration and control we talked about. In the workplace, this translates into a relentless pursuit of power and recognition. Narcissists may be very good at climbing the corporate ladder, charming their way into leadership positions. But their lack of empathy and their constant need for validation often make them terrible leaders.
So it's all about appearances and personal gain, not about actually leading and supporting a team.
Precisely, and that's where the havoc comes in. Their manipulative tactics and inability to truly connect with or support their team create a toxic work environment that can hurt everyone around them.
Wow, it's really starting to feel like a pattern here. Manipulation, lack of empathy, unstable relationships, and workplace dysfunction. It's quite a bleak picture.
It is, and unfortunately, the fallout from dealing with a narcissist can be incredibly long-lasting, affecting the victim's mental and emotional well-being for years to come.
That's a good segue into the next part of our deep dive. We've laid out the dangers. Now let's explore the lasting impact of these toxic patterns. So we just finished talking about, those 4 major dangers posed by narcissists. And now I want to shift gears a bit and talk about the long-term fallout of being in a relationship with someone like this. The text you shared, Narcissism and the Power of the Ego, really emphasizes these profound psychological effects.
Yeah, that's one of the most crucial takeaways from this deep dive.
Yeah.
We've discussed how narcissists operate, but it's equally important to understand that lasting impact their behavior can have on others.
So let's talk about those effects. What kind of psychological damage are we talking about?
The text points to a whole range of issues, including anxiety, depression, PTSD, and a deeply damaged sense of self-worth. It's not hard to see why when you consider what these victims have been through, the constant undermining gaslighting and emotional manipulation. It takes a serious toll.
Yeah, their whole sense of reality has been warped.
Yeah.
And that has to impact their ability to trust themselves and others moving forward.
Exactly. And the really insidious thing about narcissistic abuse is that it often unfolds so gradually, it can be hard to pinpoint, the exact moment when things cross the line. And by the time the victim realizes the extent of the damage, they might already be deeply entangled in the narcissist's web of control.
The text also mentions the difficulty of forming healthy relationships after being involved with a narcissist. Why is that?
Well, imagine being constantly manipulated and betrayed by someone who is supposed to love and care for you. It's only natural to become guarded, to hesitate before opening yourself up to anyone else.
Right, so the narcissist has essentially poisoned the well of human connection. Every future relationship is now viewed through this lens of suspicion and fear.
In a way, yes. It's incredibly difficult to rebuild that sense of trust and vulnerability after experiencing that level of betrayal. It can make dating or even just forming friendships feel fraught with danger.
You mentioned PTSD. Isn't that usually associated with a specific traumatic event like a car accident or something? How does that apply to narcissistic abuse?
Well, while it might not involve a single isolated event, the ongoing trauma of narcissistic abuse can be just as debilitating. The constant walking on eggshells, the fear of saying or doing the wrong thing, the emotional whiplash, it all takes a toll on the nervous system.
So those feelings of anxiety and hypervigilance can linger long after the relationship is
Yeah,
over.
absolutely. Victims of narcissistic abuse might find themselves, constantly scanning their environment for threats, struggling to relax or feel safe, even in seemingly ordinary situations.
That makes a lot of sense. So what can someone do if they've been affected by a narcissist? Where do they even begin to heal from this kind of damage?
Well, the first and most important step is recognizing what happened. It's easy to get caught up in self-blame, to wonder what you could have done differently. But it's crucial to understand that you were deliberately targeted and manipulated by someone who lacked the capacity for genuine empathy or remorse.
So it's about releasing that guilt and shame and
Okay.
acknowledging that you were the victim in this situation.
Exactly. And then comes the work of healing. Therapy can be incredibly beneficial in processing the trauma, developing coping mechanisms, and rebuilding that sense of self-worth.
Is there a specific type of therapy that's particularly helpful for this kind of abuse?
Trauma-informed therapy is often very effective. It focuses on understanding how the trauma has impacted the individual's brain and body and helps them develop strategies to manage the lingering effects.
What about support groups? Could those be beneficial as well?
Absolutely. Connecting with others who have been through similar experiences can be incredibly validating and empowering. It helps to know that you're not alone in this, that other people understand the pain and confusion you're feeling.
That sense of community and shared understanding can be incredibly powerful.
It can. And it can help to break down that isolation that often accompanies narcissistic abuse.
This is all really valuable information. But I'm also thinking about prevention. Is there anything we can do to protect ourselves from these types of people in the first place? How do we spot the red flags and avoid getting caught in these toxic cycles?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's what we'll explore in the final part of this deep dive. We'll talk about specific red flags to watch out for and strategies for setting boundaries to protect yourself from narcissistic manipulation.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from understanding the psychology of narcissism to the devastating impact it can have on relationships. But now I'm curious about the practical side of things. How can we protect ourselves from these types of personalities? It feels a bit overwhelming, to be honest.
It's a natural reaction, especially after we've, delved into the depths of this topic. But the good news is knowledge really is power. The more you understand about how narcissists operate, the better equipped you are to spot those red flags, early on.
Okay, so let's talk red flags. What are some telltale signs we should be looking out for?
Early on, it can be tricky because narcissists are often masters of charm and charisma. They can be incredibly magnetic, especially in, those initial stages of a relationship, whether romantic or professional. But there are subtle clues you can pick up on if you're paying close attention.
Like what? Give me an example.
One thing to watch for is how they talk about themselves. Do they constantly steer the conversation back to their own accomplishments, their possessions, their appearance? Do they seem to need constant validation and praise?
So someone who always has to be the center of attention, who one-ups everyone else's stories.
Exactly. That insatiable need for admiration is a hallmark of narcissism. It's like they're constantly trying to prove their worth, not just to others, but to themselves.
That makes sense given, their underlying insecurity we talked about earlier.
Right. And another red flag is, of course, that lack of empathy. Do they seem genuinely interested in what others have to say, or do they just wait for their turn to talk about themselves again? Do they ever ask about your day, your feelings, your experiences?
It's funny now that you mention it. It's almost like they're looking in a mirror, even when they're supposedly listening to you.
Hmm.
It's all about how the conversation reflects back on them.
That's a great way to put it. They see interactions through this very self-centered lens. It's all about what they can get out of it, how it feeds their ego.
Okay, so those are some good early warning signs. But let's say we've missed those, or maybe we're already in a relationship with someone who's exhibiting these traits. What then? How do we start to protect ourselves?
The most important thing is to establish and enforce clear boundaries. It's about knowing what you're willing to tolerate and what you're absolutely not okay with.
That's easier said than done, though, right? Especially if you're someone who tends to be a people pleaser or you've been conditioned to prioritize other people's needs over your own.
It absolutely takes practice.
Yeah.
And it might even require professional support to, unlearn those ingrained patterns. But setting boundaries is essential for your emotional well-being, especially when you're dealing with a narcissist.
So no more bending over backwards to appease someone who's clearly taking advantage of your good nature.
Exactly. You have the right to say no, to disagree, to prioritize your own needs, and to walk away from any situation that feels disrespectful or harmful to you.
What if they try to push back on those boundaries? I mean, narcissists aren't exactly known for taking no for an answer.
That's where documentation can be really helpful. Keeping a record of their behavior, specific incidents, dates, times. It can help you see the pattern more clearly. And it can be incredibly validating, especially if you're starting to doubt your own perceptions because of, the gaslighting.
You're right. It's hard to argue with a written record.
And if it ever comes down to it, having that documentation can be invaluable if you need to take further action, like ending the relationship, reporting abuse, or seeking legal help.
That's a good point.
Okay.
It's not about being vindictive. It's about protecting yourself.
Hmm.
And I think it's important to emphasize that you're not obligated to fix or change a narcissist. That's not your responsibility.
Absolutely. As much as you might care about this person, it's not your job to save them. Your primary focus needs to be on your own well-being and safety.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like we've gone beyond, those surface-level stereotypes of narcissism and really dug deep into the psychological dynamics at play.
And hopefully this deep dive has equipped you with the knowledge and tools you need to navigate these complex relationships, whether you choose to set boundaries within them or ultimately walk away.
You're right. Awareness is the first step towards empowerment. By understanding the patterns, the red flags, the potential consequences, we can make informed choices that protect our mental and emotional well-being. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of narcissism.
It's been my pleasure. Remember, knowledge is power, and self-awareness is the key to creating healthy, fulfilling relationships.